Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, the program that's a kind of, owner's manual for protecting the country we love against all enemies, foreign and domestic, for God's glory and that of his kingdom. We are delighted to have with us to drill down on one of the most important issues of our time, our nuclear challenges, notably from Vladimir Putin, but from others as well. Whether we are in a position to do something about those threats, and if not, what are the prospects for the unthinkable, as it's been called, actual nuclear war? Our guest is Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, no stranger to this audience, or frankly, I think to most of the rest of the world at this point. He has been featured prominently, among other places, on Mark Levin's terrific Life, Liberty, and Levin program on Fox News. But he's the author of a number of really important books, including, I think most recently, Blackout Wars and the Power and the Light. He has been very active in the public policy arena, going back to his time as an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, his time on Capitol Hill and various capacities there as a professional staff member, and on several really important national commissions looking at the threats to our electric grid and the adequacy of our strategic nuclear forces. He is a man of many parts. We're always delighted to have him, and a special welcome as a member of our cast of characters as a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy. Peter Pry, it's good to have you back. Welcome, sir.
Thank you so much for having me, Frank.
A lot to talk with you about, Peter. Most especially, I want to visit about the prospect that we are actually facing a possibly imminent nuclear war at the hands of Vladimir Putin of Russia. In the midst of all of this Ukraine business, he has been intensifying the readiness of his nuclear forces and making not so concealed threats to use them. Talk about that threat as you see it, Peter, both in terms of capabilities, which are easier to assess, but also intentions, as best we can establish those.
Yeah, on February 27th, a couple of Sundays ago, Vladimir Putin, the dictator of Russia, announced that he was putting his nuclear forces on a special combat alert, and then went down into one of the deep underground shelters, of which there are hundreds in Russia. These are hundreds of meters deep under solid granite, and they're impervious to nuclear attack and can accommodate up to 30,000 Russian elites. The Biden administration has basically tried to cover up the fact that I believe we're in a nuclear crisis with Russia that's more serious than the Cuban Missile Crisis. The administration has denied clear evidence of the Russian high alert of its nuclear forces because I think it doesn't want to admit to the American people that their Ukraine policies have brought us to a brink of nuclear war with Russia. And they would have to explain what are the vital U.S. national interests that make this risk worthwhile. Some of the evidence of Russian mobilization was just before their invasion of Ukraine, they conducted a major strategic forces exercise called Thunder. And unusually, the reentry vehicles from their missiles, these weren't live warheads, but they were dummy warheads that they normally launch in exercises. And this was an exercise of strategic as well as theater and tactical nuclear systems, called Thunder or Grom in the Russian. Normally, they would send these reentry vehicles to the Kamchatka Peninsula, which is out on the Pacific side of Russia, and it's a remote area far away from any other country. But this exercise was conducted in the Arctic Ocean off of northern Europe. And so the reentry vehicles were falling in to an area that was uncomfortably close to the NATO alliance. In Russian military doctrine, you can use a military exercise to cover the mobilization of forces, and that's almost certainly what they did. Curiously, our intelligence community, while they understood that the Russian mobilization of their conventional forces was for the invasion of Ukraine, and so it concealed an impending act of aggression by Russia, they haven't said anything and don't seem to want to come to grips with the fact that the nuclear exercise was also a mobilization for a real war. a potential nuclear war. And one of the
Peter, let me ask you about a couple of pieces of this because you've laid a very ominous table here. One of the things that you've described is the presence in the Russian nuclear warfighting capabilities of an ability to protect large numbers of at least leadership cadre, if not others among the population, from the effects of a nuclear strike by us in retaliation, presumably. I'm hearing that there are flights that are now moving large numbers of people from Moscow to the Urals, where some of the most important of those underground bunkers are. Um, to what extent does this fit into what you're talking about? Well, perhaps exercise or perhaps actual preparations for nuclear war fighting by the Kremlin?
That also fits into the paradigm of our denial of the nuclear threat, at least by the Biden administration, because they have characterized this transportation of probably Russian elites, as an exercise, when in fact it is probably not an exercise. It's probably a part of this mobilization to posture themselves to survive, fight, and win a nuclear war. The Urals are the location of some of their most important command posts. The Kozvinsky Mountain, for example, is a new general staff command post that has been completed during the Russian era. These deep underground command posts are not all from the Soviet era. Russia has continued to dig in for fighting and winning a nuclear war. Yamantau Mountain is another one that's out there in the Urals, and uh, it's a vast city-sized underground complex that also is impervious to nuclear attack. And we're not even entirely sure, have never been sure what its purpose is, except that it can accommodate, a population that's the size of a small city.
Dr. Pry, this is very ominous stuff on the leadership and defensive side. Tie that together with what we know about the other aspects of Russia's warfighting, nuclear warfighting capabilities.
Before we leave the defensive picture, it also has to be mentioned that Russia has something like 10,000 anti ballistic and air defense missiles in its inventory, which is vastly greater than the handful of national missile defense missiles that we have. The Russian strategic posture is also very different from ours. People think of the Russian triad as the same as the US triad, but it is not the same. Theirs is, in fact, a polar opposite because they are postured all the time for surprise nuclear attack in a posture called constant combat readiness, where they can launch their ICBMs, their intercontinental ballistic missiles, which include their ballistic missile submarines, which have ICBMs on them, in a matter of a few minutes. They're constantly ready to do that. So whenever Putin announces an increased combat alert and disappears into a nuclear bunker, we have to take deadly seriously that posture, the possibility of a surprise nuclear attack that in a few minutes could send hundreds of nuclear warheads, enough to basically take out the U.S. nuclear capability. The U.S. is not postured in that same way. We do not have multiple warhead ICBMs anymore, and they comprise the smallest part of our nuclear deterrent. Moreover, our nuclear forces are not modernized as are the Russians. The Russians are 90% modernized with their nuclear forces, and they exercise constantly for fighting and winning a nuclear war, including with Putin personally in charge, which is a rare thing on the U.S. side.
Very, very rare indeed. Peter Pry, we're going to have to take just a short break. When we come back, I want to talk about the Chinese threat, which we're now facing, and that of a few others, including one I think that's being greatly exacerbated by the United States government and its efforts to negotiate some deal with the Iranians. And then we're going to talk about what must we do about these various nuclear threats to prevent nuclear war from being fought and possibly lost by us. That and more straight ahead.